each different from the others. Now, sea, by the way, always carries the connotation of chaos. It's the unknown. It's sort of the place empires come from, the chaotic place of political turmoil. The first was like a lion with eagle's wings. I observed it until its wings were pulled off, and it was lifted up from the ground. It was then set on 2 feet like a human being and received a human mind. Then I saw another beast, a second one, like a bear. It was raised on one side. It had 3 ribs in its mouth between its teeth. It was told, "Get up, devour much flesh." I kept watching, and suddenly there was another beast. This one like a leopard. On its back had 4 wings like bird wings. The beast had 4 heads. Authority was given to it. After this, I continued to watch this night vision. I saw a 4th beast, terrifying and hideous, with extraordinary power and with massive iron teeth. As it ate and crushed, its feet smashed whatever was left over. It was different from all the other beasts before it. It had 10 horns. I was staring at the horns when suddenly another small horn came up between them. 3 of the earlier horns were ripped out to make room for it. On this new horn were eyes like human eyes and a mouth that bragged and bragged. As I was watching, thrones were raised up. The Ancient One took his seat. His clothes were white like snow, his hair like lamb's wool. His throne was made of fire. Its wheels were blazing fire. A river of fire flowed out from his presence. Thousands upon thousands served him. 10,000 times 10,000 stood ready to serve him. The court sat in session. The scrolls were open. I kept watching. I watched from the moment the horn started bragging until the beast was killed and its body was destroyed, handed over to be burned with fire. Then the authority of the remaining beast was brought to an end. But they were given an extension among the living for a set time and season. As I continued to watch this night vision of mine, I suddenly saw one like a human being. Coming with the heavenly clouds, he came to the Ancient One and was presented before him. Rule, glory, and kingship were given to him. All peoples, nations, and languages will serve him. His rule is an everlasting one. It will never pass away. His kingship is indestructible. What would you say to Daniel if he just came in and said, "Dude, I got to tell you about this dream I had last night"? What would you say to Daniel? I mean, you probably should go talk to somebody about this. Like that's a really weird dream. It's a dream that involves animals and they're destroying things. And then suddenly all these animals are destroyed, these beasts, and then there's a human being who shows up. I mean, this is what the last part of the book of Daniel is like. There are 4 different visions which all point to a similar point in truth. But you see what, growing up, I read Daniel 1 through 6 and stopped. Right? Because this is weird and it makes no sense. And what people often do is they try to interpret it, this is somehow about the end of the world. But I want to give you the context. Right? Because one of the things we often forget is that the Bible has context. So the book of Daniel is set during the Babylonian exile, which is in the 6th century BCE. Right? So long, long time ago. But the book of Daniel was actually written, and there's lots of ways that we know this to be true about the book of Daniel. Some of it's based on language. Some of it's based on concepts that show up that didn't exist in the 6th century yet. It was written in the 2nd century BCE. Now, what was happening in the 2nd century BCE? I'm really glad you asked. So, before that, June of 323, something that shook the world happened. Does anybody know what it was? You don't have this down yet? All right, you can pull this out at parties. June of 323, Alexander the Great died. Alexander had taken over much of the known world. He had had a campaign even as far as into India. So from Greece to India, Alexander had ruled. He died in Babylon. Some people say he was poisoned and killed. Some people say he caught some sort of sickness like malaria and died. He was 32 when he died. And he conquered the known world at 32. And when he died, they made a decision. And I'll show you a picture here. This is Alexander's kingdom. So up here in Greece, down here into Egypt, and all the way up into India, Alexander ruled. And when he died, they had to decide how to move forward. And what essentially happened is his kingdom was divided into 4 parts and given to 4 of his generals. 2 of them really didn't do anything super noteworthy. That's Alexander. And then 2 of them did. A guy named Ptolemy and a guy named Seleucus. Ptolemy took over Egypt and what we would call Palestine and those areas. Seleucus took over more of the Babylonian part of the kingdom. Eventually what happened is Seleucus overtook Ptolemy and took Palestine. Now, where's Palestine? Judea is what the Romans called it, right? It's where the action of the Bible takes place. And eventually, this guy Seleucus, and he formed a dynasty called the Seleucids, they took over that part of the world. And September 3rd of 175, so 2nd century, the era that the book of Daniel was written, a guy named Antiochus IV takes the throne, and he assumes the name Epiphanes. Epiphanes means essentially God made human, God made manifest. So this guy, Antiochus IV, believed that he was a god in human skin. And Antiochus decided that he had this mission for his new kingdom. He wanted everybody to be Hellenized. The word Hellenization simply means that it's the spread of Greek culture, ideas, religion, and language. I like to call it the Greekification of the world. Right? It's saying, hey, we've done a really good job. We've got some really good philosophers. We've got a good religious system. We've got a really cool language. Let's spread this over the whole world and let's make everybody the same. We'll all speak the same language. We'll all worship the same gods. We'll all go to the same sort of extracurricular activities. We're all going to be one and the same. And big, large parts of the world, I mean, this is why they call it Koine Greek. It means common Greek. At one point, everybody in the world spoke Greek. It was the language of the day. Everybody pretty much spoke it. So this guy Antiochus decides we've got to do some Hellenization of the world. We've got to make something happen. And in 167, he took this even farther. He decided that since these Hebrew people were being cantankerous about it, that he would just defile their temple. And so in a minute, we're going to read a little section about this. But you've probably heard, how many of you have heard the phrase, the abomination of desolation? It's not a rock band. I know it seems like it might be a rock band. It's not a rock band. It's actually something Jesus even talks about the temple that stood in his day. But this is about the temple that stood in Daniel's day. And it was when Antiochus ordered an altar to Zeus to be placed in the temple and a pig to be sacrificed on it. All right, so if you want to defile a Jewish holy place, a monotheistic holy place, what do? You take in a pluralistic deity and you take in an unclean sacrifice and you offer it in the Holy of Holies. So this is the level of difficulty they were dealing with in Daniel's day. They were absolutely under attack. I want to read you just a section. How many of you ever heard of the book of Maccabees, First Maccabees? So in the Bible, in the Protestant Bible, you don't grow up knowing about this, but if you grew up Catholic or Jewish, in your Bibles, there would have been this extra set of books called the Apocrypha, or it's also called the Deuterocanonical books. And they contain stories that are often said to be from the intertestamental period, right? So between the book of Daniel and although Daniel is actually an intertestamental book, they just didn't know that back then. But essentially between the end of the Hebrew Bible and the beginning of the New Testament, stuff that happened. I want to read you a section of First Maccabees, and let's see if you get kind of a picture of what the world would have been like. This is about Antiochus. After subduing Egypt, Antiochus returned in the 143rd year. He went up against Israel and came to Jerusalem with a strong force. He arrogantly entered the sanctuary and took the golden altar, the lampstand for the light, and all its utensils. He also took the table for the bread of presence, the cups for drink offerings, the bowls, the golden censers, the curtain, the crowns, and the gold decoration on the front of the temple. He stripped it all off. He took the silver and the gold and the costly vessels. He took them also hidden treasures that were found. Taking them, he went into his own land. So he comes in and he ransacks the temple and takes all the valuable articles of worship. Now listen to this, verse 41. Then the king wrote to his whole kingdom that all should be one people and that all should give up their particular customs. All the Gentiles accepted the command of the king. Many, even from Israel, gladly adopted his religion. They sacrificed to idols and profaned the Sabbath. The king sent letters by messengers to Jerusalem and the towns of Judah. He directed them to follow customs strange to the land, to forbid burnt offerings and sacrifices and drink offerings in the sanctuary, to profane Sabbaths and festivals, to defile the sanctuary and the priests, to build altars and sacred precincts for shrines for idols, to sacrifice swine and other unclean animals, and to leave their sons uncircumcised. They were to make themselves abominable by everything unclean and profane, so that they would forget the law and change all its ordinances. He added, whoever does not obey the command of the king shall die. By the way, that's what persecution looks like. Are you with me? That's what persecution actually looks like. He says, if you don't stop being Jewish, we're going to kill you. And so what they go on to talk about is that several folks, lots of people decided that they would just participate in the Greek way of life. They started going to the Greek gymnasium where they exercised nude, which was sort of the Israelites frowned upon, but they went and participated. You even had men trying to disguise that they were circumcised at the gymnasium because they didn't want to be singled out as being different. This guy, Antiochus, launches this campaign to snuff out the Jewish religion. And how many of you have heard of Hanukkah? Right? This is where the story of Hanukkah comes from. You have the family of Maccabees who resist and revolt and eventually defeat Antiochus and reclaim their temple. Right? That's where the story of Hanukkah comes from. But this guy Antiochus, do you see how in the book of Daniel they might be talking about he's talking about Babylon, but are they really talking about Babylon? Who are they really talking about? When they refuse to eat the food that's been offered to them, who's the book of Daniel talking about? Antiochus. When they refuse to bow down and worship the statue and they're thrown in a furnace, who are they talking about? Antiochus. They're using Babylon because guess what? If you are being persecuted by a world empire, you really don't want to start publishing literature that says, hey, by the way, don't you think Antiochus needs to go? Like, if you went on Twitter, you wouldn't be like, somebody needs to get rid of this dude. Right? But if you talk about another king and another kingdom and you show how bad they were and how that even though it seems bad, God hasn't forgotten us. Do you see how that would be? They're trying to encourage people. You don't have to eat their food. You don't have to follow their customs. You don't have to abandon the traditions of your ancestors. We can do something about it. God can do something about it. Don't abandon the way just because it's difficult. You come back to Daniel, right? 4 kingdoms, the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, and finally the 4th beast, which is the worst of all, the Greeks. That's who Antiochus came from. And there are these horns, and then there's this little horn. The horn is a symbol of strength. And this little horn that boasts arrogantly, how many of you have ever seen a horn boast arrogantly, by the way? We're firmly in the realm of symbol. It's Antiochus. And what happens to Antiochus in this story? He is ripped out. The beast is destroyed. And suddenly, in Daniel 7, I saw one like a human being. And this one like a human being was given rule, glory, and kingship. All peoples, nations, and languages would serve him. His rule is an everlasting rule. It will never pass away. Do you see what the writer of Daniel is trying to do in this vision? What were the 4 kingdoms before this one? They were beasts. Right? They were animal. They were cruel. They were barbaric. They were destructive. And Daniel says, but there's going to be a king. And in this context is standing for Israel. Eventually, Christians came to interpret this as Jesus, right? But in the beginning, it was interpreted by the Jewish folks as this is about our people. Somebody's going to sit on the throne, and somebody's going to be truly human. See, that's the thing. They're saying everybody who's ruled the world has done it in a beastly fashion. They've taken what they've wanted. They've destroyed. They've blown up. They've bombed. They've been, at times, cruel. But there's coming a kingdom. And it's going to be truly human. How many of you were taught to believe that being human was bad? Anybody else? Like, what else can you be? Right? We've been taught that being human is somehow bad. Being human in the scriptures is to bear the image of God. Do we make mistakes? Yes. Do we sometimes blow it and do the wrong thing? Absolutely. But that's usually when we're living beneath our humanity. Right? If you want to see people live beneath their humanity, just go on the internet. They're not being human, they're being subhuman. Right? When we live in ways that are mean and destructive and hateful, we're not being human. We're living beneath ourselves. We're being subhuman. And Daniel has a vision of someday a kingdom coming that will be truly human, that will not be beastly, that will not mistreat. A truly human kingdom that will repair and heal the world. How's that sound? Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? A kingdom that is compassionate and just. A kingdom that will never end. And that's what Daniel was telling his people. We've got to work for that. We've got to keep going. Because God is on our side. And these kingdoms, they will fall. These kingdoms will all fall. But there's a kingdom. If we join with God and each other, there's a kingdom coming that might change the world. That's the point of the book of Daniel. Don't give up when it's difficult because change can happen. Now, a couple of takeaways from this as we move toward communion. One, by the way, I would say if you're talking to people in Daniel, they would say it's not the end of the world, it's the end of the world as they knew it. And they wanted it to happen.